More than 7,000 sinkholes have opened around the Dead Sea since the 1980s, some large enough to swallow a 2-lane road overnight. No single agency has ever produced a complete count of how many more are forming right now, underground, before the surface even cracks. The sea itself sits roughly 430 meters below sea level, the lowest point on Earth's land surface, and its water is close to 34% salt, nearly 10 times the concentration of ordinary ocean water. That salinity is why a body floats on the surface without effort, the fact most visitors already know before they arrive. What most visitors do not know is that the shoreline retreating behind them is the same process opening holes in the ground for kilometers around it. Over the next several minutes, we will walk through 11 documented stages of that collapse, ending with a detail about the sea's basin that even some of the researchers monitoring it did not expect. Here's what we actually know about the floating first, because it is the easiest fact to verify and the hardest to feel in your own body. Human tissue is close to the density of fresh water, which is why a swimmer without training still tends to sink slightly before adjusting. Dead sea water is so dense with dissolved minerals, mostly magnesium chloride, sodium chloride, and calcium chloride, that the human body becomes buoyant almost immediately, no swimming technique required. Bathers are typically warned not to let the water reach their eyes or any open cut, because the concentration that keeps a person afloat is also sharp enough to cause real irritation within seconds. That part of the story is settled, and has been for over a century of recorded tourism. The part that gets far less attention is the sea's size, which has been quietly changing for decades. The Dead Sea has been shrinking by close to 1 meter in surface elevation every year, and it has dropped more than 40 meters total since the middle of the 20th century. Satellite images taken a generation apart show a shoreline that has physically retreated by more than a kilometer in some places, leaving dry, cracked ground where boats once docked. Officially, the explanation is simple. Less water is flowing in than flows out through evaporation. The problem is that the flowing in part used to be reliable, and it no longer is. The Jordan River is the Dead Sea's primary natural inflow, and for most of the 20th century, Israel, Jordan, and Syria have each diverted large portions of that river's flow for agriculture and drinking water before it ever reaches the sea. Researchers studying the basin generally agree that upstream diversion, combined with mineral extraction operations on the sea's southern end, accounts for the majority of the water loss, though the exact split between those two causes is still debated among hydrologists. This is where most explanations quietly stop, with a shrinking lake and a straightforward irrigation story. But here's the detail that doesn't fit that tidy narrative. The ground around the retreating shoreline has been collapsing into holes, thousands of them, and the sea's disappearance is only the first half of the mechanism. If you find topics like this, places where a well-known landmark is hiding an active geological process most people never hear about, genuinely interesting, this channel builds an entire catalog of them, and sticking around means you won't miss the next one. The sinkhole mechanism itself is the part worth slowing down for, because it is not simply erosion. Thousands of years ago, during a period when the Dead Sea Basin held a much larger body of water that geologists often refer to as Lake Lisan, thick layers of salt were deposited on what is now dry land as that ancient lake evaporated and receded over time. As the modern Dead Sea has continued dropping, groundwater and seasonal floodwater have been reaching those buried salt layers for the first time in millennia, since the water table that used to protect them has fallen along with the sea itself. That fresh water does something the ancient salt layers were never built to withstand. It dissolves them. Salt is far more soluble than the surrounding sediment, so as underground water works its way through the deposits, it hollows out cavities beneath the surface that can remain invisible for months or even years. Eventually, the ground above a cavity loses enough support that it collapses all at once, and what looked like ordinary desert floor the day before becomes a hole that can be 10, 20, or in some documented cases, over 25 meters across. The area around Ein Gedi on the western shore has been one of the most heavily affected zones, and it illustrates the pace of this better than any single statistic. Roads that once ran along the coastline have been rerouted more than once because sections simply dropped away. A former palm grove and sections of a popular beach and hot spring site have been closed to the public after multiple collapses. And at least one hotel structure in the wider region has had to be evacuated due to ground instability nearby. What makes this unsettling for local engineers is not any individual sinkhole. It's that the rate of new sinkholes has kept climbing even as monitoring technology has improved, not slowed. Here's a fact that tends to generate real disagreement whenever it comes up. Some regional water planners have defended the mineral extraction industry operating on the Dead Sea's southern basin, arguing the economic value of potash and bromide production outweighs the accelerated water loss those operations cause. Others studying the basin describe that trade-off as short-sighted, given that the southern basin today survives only because it is artificially fed through pumping. It would otherwise have dried out completely decades ago. Whichever side of that argument you land on, it's worth sitting with in the comments, because the industry isn't going anywhere, and neither is the sinkhole count tied to it. That last point deserves unpacking, because it surprises a lot of people the first time they hear it clearly stated. The Dead Sea today is not really one continuous body of water. It is functionally two basins. The northern basin is the natural lake most images of the Dead Sea show. The southern basin, where most of the potash evaporation ponds sit, would have vanished as an independent body of water decades ago if it weren't continuously refilled by pumped water specifically to keep the industrial ponds operating. In other words, part of what tourists photograph as the Dead Sea today is being kept alive artificially, while the actual natural lake beside it keeps dropping. Researchers with the Geological Survey of Israel and several regional universities have been mapping new sinkhole formations for years, using both ground surveys and radar-based monitoring to try to predict where the ground is likely to collapse next before it happens. That predictive mapping has had some real success. Certain unstable zones have been fenced off or evacuated ahead of visible collapse. What the data doesn't explain, even with that monitoring in place, is why sinkhole formation has clustered so heavily in specific stretches of shoreline, while leaving other similarly exposed stretches almost untouched. The soil composition and water table depth only account for part of that pattern, according to researchers who have published on the subject, and no complete model has settled the rest. There is also the matter of what happens beneath the surface that no one has fully mapped. Ground-penetrating radar can detect voids that are already forming, but it cannot reliably predict which patch of desert will develop a hidden cavity next, or how large that cavity will grow before the surface gives way. That means the 7,000-plus sinkholes documented since the 1980s are very likely an undercount of the total underground dissolution taking place. How many cavities currently exist without having collapsed yet is a number nobody can currently give you, and it may not be answerable with existing survey technology. Now for the detail that ties the shrinking and the collapsing together into something closer to a paradox than a simple environmental story. The very fact that makes the Dead Sea famous, its extreme density, the mineral concentration that lets a body float without effort, is chemically inseparable from the process destroying the land around it. The minerals that make swimmers buoyant are the same minerals deposited over thousands of years by an ancient, larger version of this same sea that are now dissolving into sinkholes the moment fresh water reaches them again. The tourist attraction and the geological hazard are not two separate stories happening in the same location. They are the same chemistry, observed at two different points in time, thousands of years apart. That should have settled the question of whether the sea's famous property and its current instability are related. It didn't, not entirely, because researchers still don't agree on how much of the sinkhole activity would be happening anyway, as a natural consequence of the basin's geologic history, even without modern water diversion accelerating the drop. Some studies argue the human-driven water loss has simply sped up an inevitable process by decades or centuries. Others argue that without the diversion, the sea's level would have stayed high enough that the exposed salt layers driving the sinkholes would never have been reached by fresh groundwater at all, at least not on any timescale relevant to us. That disagreement remains unresolved in the published research, and it's one of the genuine open questions in this story, rather than a settled footnote. If current trends hold, a meter of elevation lost most years, thousands of new sinkholes documented each decade. Some hydrologists have projected the Dead Sea could reach a new, smaller natural equilibrium sometime later this century, stabilizing at a lower level once inflow and evaporation roughly balance out again. Other researchers are far less confident in any such projection, pointing out that regional water demand, further diversion, and the pace of mineral extraction are all political and economic variables, not physical constants, and none of them are especially predictable across multiple decades. So here's the honest split stated plainly. It is documented and not in dispute that the Dead Sea has dropped more than 40 meters since the mid-20th century, that upstream diversion and mineral extraction are the primary drivers, and that more than 7,000 sinkholes have formed as a direct chemical consequence of that drop, exposing ancient salt layers to fresh water. It is not resolved how many undetected cavities currently exist beneath the surface, how much of this process would have happened without human intervention, or what stable state, if any, the basin eventually settles into. The same water that lets a swimmer float without trying near Ein Gedi today is chemically continuous with a lake that existed there thousands of years before recorded history, and with the ground collapsing a few kilometers down that same shoreline right now. That is not a coincidence dressed up as one. It is one continuous mineral process, running on a timescale most visitors never think to ask about while they're busy taking a photograph of themselves floating on their back. Whether that shoreline stabilizes, keeps receding, or someday reconnects the sea to another water source, as some long-proposed regional pipeline projects have suggested but never completed, remains one of the more open questions attached to any landmark this well known.